Blakely was the home of Richard Scott Blackburn Washington, the first Washington to live to an old age, because he survived to be 88 and died in 1910. He'd married in 1844 his third cousin from Harewood, Christian Maria Washington, and set up housekeeping at Blakely, his widowed mother's home, and proceeded to have a family of 9 children. 2 of the little girls died as babies in 1852, and at the time of the 1850 census, there were only 2 living children. He was a farmer, of course, primarily, and thought of himself as a farmer. He was the younger of 2 sons of his father, and it was understood that his older brother would inherit Mount Vernon, and he would always have Blakely. He was a gentle kind of person who his mother said was dearly beloved by all the neighbors, everybody he knew, everybody who knew him. Life was, as far as I know, uneventful during the 1850s. A series of children came along, and he lived there quietly. The whole family probably went down to Mount Vernon a good deal, where his brother was also established, and his mother made it a seasonal thing and stayed down at Mount Vernon in the winter and came up to cool Jefferson County and Blakely in the summer. I think the calm of life at Blakely was upset by the John Brown raid, and after that, I'm sure the atmosphere throughout Jefferson County and at Blakely was quite different. But the interesting thing, of course, about Blakely was that the other family house, Claymont, was right across the little valley from them, and the 2 Claymont and Blakely Washington families went back and forth all the time, continuously. It was half a mile. In 1858 and 60, things really began to change. First, his brother John Augustine sold Mount Vernon in 1858 and bought a place called Waveland in Fauquier County. Secondly, the Civil War was descending upon them. Then his brother's wife died in 1859 or 60, I forget which. Then, when war was declared, his brother immediately joined General Lee as an officer on his staff, and in 1861 he was killed. At this point, Richard at Blakely had the responsibility for his brother's 7 orphans. The oldest was a girl of 17, as well as his own 6 or 7 surviving children, and the responsibility for the family at Waveland, where there was no adult really to live, and his responsibility at Blakely. Furthermore, these 2 brothers had a sister. She had died in 1850, leaving a widower, Dr. Alexander, and I think maybe 4 or 5 of her 7 children survived. They were all dying off at a rapid rate of tuberculosis, or most of them. And that was another family for which he had a good deal of responsibility, especially when Dr. Alexander died in 1862. When the war came, he quixotically insisted upon volunteering as a private. He felt that it was wrong to go take a commission just because you were related to all the officers and knew everybody who was an officer. And at the age of almost 40, he joined up as a private, where all the other privates were 20 years old and younger. But then when his brother, in September of 61, was killed, General Lee said, "This is nonsense. You go home and take care of your responsibilities. This is, merely a gesture, being a private in the Army at your age." And I think this was an unhappy sore point with him all of his life, because he wasn't really a real Confederate veteran who had served through the war. And he lived on after the war for 45 or 50 years, never being perhaps the only man who wasn't either in Charlestown that wasn't either a Confederate veteran private or officer. The next event at Blakely was a chimney fire which gutted the house in November of 1864. And we can always date the Blakely fire because the family was having a prayer service Sunday morning over at Claymont across the little valley when the chimney caught on fire and Blakely began to burn. They all ran over there and began to carry things out. They carried out Charlie Alexander, who was dying of tuberculosis there. And my great-grandmother was pregnant with her 9th child, and she was running all around trying to wet down things that had been carried out from the house so they wouldn't burn up. And along came Cousin Nanny Burnett to see what was going on, happened, maybe coming home from church or something, and saw Christian running around like this, half crazy with the fire and everything in the house being destroyed. And she made her get in her carriage, wagon, whatever it was, and took her to Burnley, where Cousin Nanny lived. And that night, Christian had her 9th child. So we always know that the story always ends, and that was the night that de Hertburn was born, because they named this 9th baby William de Hertburn because Washington Irving's biography of George Washington had written that the Washingtons descended from a man named William de Hertburn who lived in England around the year 1100. And several people were named William de Hertburn Washington as a result of that. But this was Blakely Hurt. And there was another one that came out of the family over at Lewis William Washington's family, whom they called Fancy Hurt. And there was a later William de Hertburn Washington I knew who lived up in Riverton, New Jersey, a lot of them. After 1864, after the fire, the family moved over to Harewood from Blakely, which was his wife's family home, and lived there for a while. And after the war, Richard tried to rebuild, maybe did to some extent rebuild and repair Blakely. But in the poverty after the war, he eventually lost it. And I think the first person who bought it was Colonel Chew, who had married the oldest of the Mount Vernon family of children. And that was another, I think, great disappointment to Richard. Two of his sons, John and Samuel, stayed here in Charlestown and were prominent citizens. Samuel Walter was a lawyer, and Uncle John had an insurance office and real estate office on Main Street right next to the bank, and I think was director of the Bank of Charlestown, and they were prominent people around town here. The other three brothers went away. My grandfather to New Mexico, to Hertburn, who was born in '64, to Arizona, and George up to Philadelphia. And Aunt Christine, their sister, who stayed here and was the glue that helped the family together, always said that the brothers who stayed home in Charlestown did better than those that had gone away to seek their fortunes. Long in 1895, Christian died, and then Richard and his two sons here, John and Uncle Walter, built the house at 216 South George Street, brick house, and moved into town. And much later, in 1917, when my mother married into the family and was brought here from away and introduced to the family, and Aunt Christine took her out to see Harewood, which was sitting vacant except for tenants, and my mother admired it and came back, and being young and brash, sort of said to Aunt Christine, "I don't see how you could have borne to leave that lovely old house in the country and move in," the implication, to this brick monstrosity in town. And Aunt Christine said, "My dear," she said, "if you could have seen the distance to the garden house, you would have understood." But the family never lived at Blakely until the 1870s, and it went through different ownerships after that for a long time. And they moved into George Street around 1899 or 1900, and so that was the family home in the 20th century, or the first half of it. When I came to Charlestown as a visitor in the 1920s as a child, town was full of cousins of one kind and another, distant and close, all sorts of relatives. Today they've all gone away elsewhere, and there are almost none left. I can only think of 3 around town at the moment, which is very strange to me.